The night they came for Caruso, it was Lee who stopped them, the young pastry chef with flour still on her apron, the one who'd burned a whole tray of croissants that morning and cried in the walk-in about it. That part matters because nobody saw it coming. Lee Navarro hadn't seen it coming either. She was 26, she was tired, and she was 3 weeks behind on her mother's medical bills. She was the last person in the world anyone should have been afraid of, and yet. Richard Caruso didn't run the city, so much as he owned the idea of it. Every contractor who broke ground on a new building, every city councilman who wanted to stay a city councilman, every union rep who liked keeping his kneecaps, they all moved through Richard Caruso's invisible orbit without ever once believing they had a choice. He was 71 years old, built like a man who had once been physically powerful and had since converted that power into something more durable. A stillness that made other men nervous. He ate dinner at Meridian every Thursday night. Had done so for 16 years. Table 12, tucked against the north wall where he could see both the kitchen entrance and the front door without turning his head. His napkin was always folded into a triangle. His water was always still, never sparkling. His wine was always poured by the sommelier personally, never by the junior staff. He was a man of precise and rigid habits, which was either admirable or a liability, depending on which side of the table you sat on. Lee was not supposed to be at Meridian on Thursday nights. She worked the morning prep shift, came in at 4 a.m. to start the laminated doughs, left by early afternoon before the dinner service swallowed the kitchen whole. But the pastry chef who was supposed to cover the dessert station, a meticulous older man named Gerald, had thrown out his back 2 days earlier, and the executive chef had looked at Lee the way executive chefs always looked at junior staff when they needed something uncomfortable done. Just the dessert plating, he'd told her. 2 hours, maybe 3. I'll comp your next day off. She'd said yes because she always said yes. That was Lee's problem, according to her mother, who said it with affection but also with a specific kind of exhaustion that came from watching someone you loved spend years being useful to people who didn't deserve it. So Lee was there, standing at the pastry station in the far corner of Meridian's kitchen at 9:47 p.m., piping rosettes onto a chocolate tart when the night fell apart. She heard the front entrance first. Not a knock, not the sound of the host stand chairs scraping back to greet someone. What she heard was the specific, impossible sound of a door being removed from its context. A flat crack of wood giving up its relationship with the frame, followed by a silence so total that even the cooks at the sauté station stopped moving. She would learn later that the man who came through that door was called Brecht, 6'4", 280 pounds, former private military contractor, current problem that very wealthy and very frightened people paid other wealthy people to make go away. He'd taken something before he arrived. The paramedics would spend an hour arguing about exactly what. And whatever it was had done to his nervous system what a tuning fork does to a crystal glass, vibrated it at exactly the frequency required to make it shatter. Brecht was not subtle. Brecht did not need to be subtle. Subtlety was a tool for men who weren't built like structural architecture. Lee didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was that the kitchen had gone quiet, and in restaurant kitchens, quiet was always wrong. She set down her piping bag and moved to the narrow window cut into the wall between the kitchen and the dining room. Through it, she could see the main floor in slices. White tablecloths, candlelight, the chandelier throwing its usual bronze warmth over the room. And then, moving through that warmth like something that didn't belong in it, a man so large he seemed to compress the space around him. He walked with the total absence of hesitation. That was what hit Lee first, before the size, before anything else. He didn't scan the room the way nervous people do. He didn't pause. He moved toward table 12 the way water moves downhill, because that was simply where he was going, and physics was not going to argue with him about it. Caruso's 2 men were already on their feet. She could see that. One of them, the younger one who always sat to Caruso's left, had his hand inside his jacket. The other was stepping forward, putting himself between Brecht and the table. Brecht picked up a chair, not to sit in, to throw. The chair hit the younger guard at shoulder height and sent him backward into the table behind him. Crystals shattered. A woman screamed once, then muffled it like she was afraid the sound would make things worse. The second guard managed to get his hand on Brecht's arm, which was roughly as effective as trying to redirect a freight train with a firm request. Brecht looked down at the hand on his arm with something that might have been curiosity, then turned and drove the guard's face into the nearest wall with a single movement. The man slid down the wall and didn't get up. 6 seconds, maybe 7. Caruso had not moved. This was either composure or shock, and from where Lee was standing, pressed against the kitchen wall with her flour-dusted apron and her useless piping bag, she genuinely couldn't tell which. She should have gone for the back exit. Every person in the kitchen was already moving toward it. She could see them in her peripheral vision, the sous chef pulling the dishwasher by the elbow, the line cooks abandoning their stations. The emergency exit at the back of the kitchen led to the service alley, and the service alley led to the street, and the street led to somewhere that was not this. Lee did not go for the back exit. She wasn't sure later that she could explain why. It wasn't bravery, not exactly. Bravery implies a calculation, implies weighing the danger and deciding to proceed anyway. What Lee felt was something more like the opposite of calculation, a short circuit where the rational part of her brain simply stopped generating options. She stepped through the kitchen's swinging door and into the dining room. Brecht had reached table 12. Caruso was standing now, his chair pushed back, his hands flat on the table in that particular way that men have when they're deciding whether the situation calls for money or something else. He was looking up at Brecht the way a man looks at weather, not surprised, not afraid, just doing the assessment. "I know who sent you," Caruso said. His voice was the same voice Lee had heard order his dinner. Unhurried, specific, the voice of a man who had spoken in high-stakes rooms so often that the stakes had simply stopped registering. "Tell them the price went up." Brecht did not appear interested in delivering messages. He was reaching for Caruso when Lee picked up the champagne bottle. It was still in the ice bucket, upright, full, a bottle of something expensive that some couple at table 9 had ordered to celebrate what had apparently been very good news. Lee had noticed it earlier because she'd been the one to carry the dessert menus past that table. She noticed things. It was one of her more useless qualities. She'd always thought, this tendency to absorb ambient detail without being asked to. She grabbed the neck of the bottle. She didn't think about what she was doing, or rather, she thought about her mother. Specifically, she thought about the medical center on the north side of the city, 4th floor, the room with the window that faced the parking structure and never got any real light. She thought about the sound her mother's voice made on the phone lately, thin and a little far away, the voice of someone who was working very hard not to alarm the people who loved her. Then she swung the champagne bottle at the back of Brecht's head with both hands. It made a sound she had not expected, lower than she'd imagined, more solid. Brecht stumbled forward, one hand catching the edge of Caruso's table, and champagne went everywhere. Over the tablecloth, over Caruso's suit jacket, over the floor. The bottle hadn't broken, which surprised her. She'd assumed bottles broke when you did that. Apparently they didn't. Brecht turned around. She had about 2 full seconds to look at his face and understand, fully and completely, what she had just done. His eyes were the wrong size. Pupils blown out, the irises almost swallowed. There was blood on his collar that hadn't been there when he walked in, blood that belonged to someone she hadn't seen. He was looking at her the way you look at something so far below your threat threshold that your brain almost refuses to file it as a problem. "Little girl," he said. His voice was damaged, wet, like something was wrong with the machinery of it. "You should not have done that." Probably not. She was surprised to find that her voice was steady. She didn't have time to be more surprised than that because Brecht charged. She threw herself sideways, behind the serving station that ran along the north wall, and Brecht's fist came down on the edge of the counter where she'd been standing. The impact bent the metal bracket that held the counter to the wall. She felt the vibration of it through the floor under her feet. What she did next, she would not be able to fully account for later. There was a cart nearby, the dessert cart, Meridian's absurd and beloved mahogany dessert cart, with its tiered shelves and its little brass wheels, the one that got rolled table to table during service and that Lee had loaded exactly 2 hours ago with tarts and petit fours and a pear galette she was privately proud of. She grabbed it, wheeled it hard into the back of Brecht's legs, and when he stumbled, she stepped up onto the lower shelf of the cart, and from that half-height launched herself onto his back. She got her forearm around his throat before she had a chance to think about whether that was a good idea. He was enormous. She weighed 118 pounds. The math was not in her favor, but Lee had grown up in a neighborhood on the west side of Phoenix, where the math was regularly not in anyone's favor, and she'd spent 2 years doing jiu-jitsu at a gym that charged $20 a month, because the owner, a retired firefighter named Jeff, believed that women who couldn't afford to protect themselves were just women who hadn't been given the chance to learn. She'd stopped going when her mother's diagnosis changed the family's financial architecture permanently. But the body remembers. She locked her legs around Brecht's torso, tightened her forearm across his throat, and held. He grabbed her arms and tried to pull. She held. He crashed backward into the wall, trying to use her weight against the surface to dislodge her. She tucked her chin, took the impact on her shoulder blades, held. She could feel his pulse hammering against her arm, fast, chemical, the rhythm of something operating well past its manufacturer's recommendations. She could feel him fighting the compression the way a car engine fights when the oil is gone. Everything working, nothing lubricated. The whole system grinding toward a point where it simply would not work anymore. It took 40 seconds. To Lee, it felt like 40 minutes. Brecht went down in stages, first the knees, then sideways, then horizontal, carrying her with him. She rolled free before he was fully on the ground, came up on her hands and knees on the restaurant floor, and stayed there for a moment just breathing. The dining room was almost empty. People had fled, tables overturned, candles extinguished by the draft of the exits being hit in rapid succession. Somewhere a fire sprinkler was ticking, deciding. The chandelier was still on, swaying slightly from whatever structural argument Brecht had started with the walls, throwing gold light over the wreckage the way chandeliers always do, indifferently, beautifully, without any awareness of what was underneath them. Lee looked up. Richard Caruso was still at table 12. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on a human face before. She would later understand that she was seeing, for possibly the first time in 30 years, surprise, real surprise. Not the performed version, not the strategic version, the genuine article. "Who?" he said slowly. It wasn't a question. It was something closer to a philosophical problem. "I work in the kitchen," Lee said. She was looking at Brecht, watching his chest rise and fall. Unconscious, not dead. She'd been careful about that. She didn't examine the fact that she'd been careful about it. Pastry station. I wasn't even supposed to be here tonight. Caruso looked down at Brecht, then back at her. His jacket was soaked with champagne. His expression was working through something complicated. "He's not alone," Lee said. She was upright now, and her body was starting to submit its damage report. Left shoulder aching where she'd taken the wall, a cut on her palm from something she couldn't identify, her ribs complaining in the way that ribs do when they've been compressed in ways they weren't designed for. Someone this size doesn't walk into a place like this without backup outside. "You need to move." Caruso blinked. For a man who had not visibly blinked in several minutes, it was notable. "You know a great deal about this type of situation," he said. "For a pastry chef. The gym where I learned to fight was next to a bail bondsman's office," Lee said. "Mr. Caruso, is there a way out of this building that isn't the front entrance?" She watched him make his decision about her. She could see it happening, the same way you can see weather changing, before it actually changes, a shift in pressure, in light. He was a man who had spent 50 years reading people, and she was apparently not reading the way he expected. "The freight access," he said finally, "behind the kitchen. Then we need to go now before whoever's outside realizes it's taking too long." They were halfway across the dining room when the second team came in through the service entrance. There were 3 of them, and unlike Brecht, they were structured, spaced properly, moving in the kind of trained formation that suggested someone had invested serious money in their education. They wore plain clothes rather than tactical gear, which was somehow more frightening. Tactical gear announces itself. Plain clothes implies confidence that announcement is not necessary. Lee stopped. Caruso, to his credit, stopped behind her rather than trying to push past. The team spread out, the middle man holding position while the other 2 angled to bracket the room. They were well practiced and very calm, and Lee recognized in about 4 seconds that they were not here for Caruso. The middle man looked at her, not at Caruso, at her. "Ley Navarro," he said. Pleasant voice, the voice of someone reading from a card. "We'd like to talk." Behind her, she heard Caruso make a sound she couldn't identify, the sound of a man reassessing something rapidly. She said nothing. "We know about the task force," the middleman said. "We know about your 18 months at the Ridgemont Financial Complex. We know about the document transfers." He paused. "We'd just like to have a conversation. You and your employer walk out. Nobody gets hurt. You make this complicated, and Mr. Caruso becomes a variable." Caruso, in a low voice, said, "You work for a task force." "Worked," Lee said, the same register. Past tense. It got shut down. Why is it shut down? Politics. Budget. Someone decided the people we were investigating were more valuable as donors than as defendants. She said it the way you say things you've made peace with, flatly, without inflection. 18 months of work. Gone. And you were here because I was building a case, and the case needed time. And going dark in a service job was the cleanest way to buy that time without anyone knowing I was still looking. She paused. Brecht showing up tonight was not part of my timeline. The middleman was watching this exchange with the careful attention of someone who finds it professionally interesting. 30 seconds, he said. Then we stop asking nicely. Ley looked at the room, assessed it the way she had assessed every room she'd been in for the past 18 months. Exits, sight lines, available materials, the physics of the space. 3 trained men. No visible firearms, but that meant nothing. The chandelier above them was swaying from a draft she couldn't locate. Two of the dining tables between her and the team were still upright. There was a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the host stand. She thought about her mother, 4th floor. The window facing the parking structure. She thought about the 18 months she'd spent building something careful and meticulous and quietly devastating, the kind of work that didn't get done again once someone decided to erase it. She thought about what it meant to let that work just be erased. "If I come with you," she said to the middleman, "what happens to him? Not our business. That's not an answer. It's the answer we have." Caruso, behind her, said quietly, "You don't have to negotiate for me." "I know," Lee said. "I'm not worth it." She turned her head slightly, not quite looking at him. "You might be surprised," she said, "what I think is worth it." She was not thinking about Caruso when she said it. She was thinking about everyone who had moved through his orbit. The contractors, the councilmen, the union reps, the people downstream of his decisions who had never gotten to make decisions of their own. She was thinking about testimony. Specific, detailed, documented testimony. From a man who had spent 50 years being the person that other people answered to. She was thinking about the fact that the case didn't have to be dead just because the task force was. "Time's up," the middleman said. The fire extinguisher was 8 feet to her left. She went for it. What followed was not elegant. She had no illusions about elegance. The man nearest the host stand was fast, faster than she'd calibrated for, and he got a hand on her arm before she reached the wall. She spun into the grab rather than away from it, used his momentum to bring her elbow up into the hinge of his jaw, and he went sideways into the host stand with enough force to scatter the evening's reservations across the marble floor. She pulled the extinguisher from the wall. The two remaining men were moving. She discharged the extinguisher in a wide arc, not at them specifically, but at the space between them and herself, at the chandelier directly above them, filling the room with a white chemical cloud that caught the light and turned everything briefly, disorienting. She heard coughing. She heard feet on marble moving in directions that weren't coordinated anymore. She grabbed Caruso, who was closer to her than she'd expected, who had apparently moved toward the sound of the impact rather than away from it. She filed that away and moved. The freight corridor was cold and poorly lit, the kind of back passage that nice restaurants maintain, because the alternative is guests seeing where the actual work happens. It smelled like industrial cleaner and old cardboard. Their footsteps were too loud. She could hear shouting somewhere behind them, the team reorienting, which meant they had less time than she wanted and more than she feared. "The building has a loading bay," Caruso said, slightly breathless in a way that suggested he was working to hide it. "Connects to the parking structure on the west side. Can you access it without a key?" "I own the building," he said. "So yes." She looked at him briefly. He met the look without flinching. "Of course you do," she said, and kept moving. They made the loading bay. Caruso hit a panel on the wall and a heavy door rolled back, admitting the cold and the ambient sound of the city at night. Traffic, distant sirens, the particular white noise of a downtown that kept moving regardless of what happened inside individual buildings. The parking structure was across a narrow access lane, its fluorescent lights blinking in the irregular way of fluorescent lights that had been reporting the same maintenance request to nobody for years. They moved across the lane, and moving toward the far stairwell, when Caruso said, "They'll have the exits covered." "Some of them," Lee said. "Not the roof access. They didn't have time to set a full perimeter." "You're certain?" "No," she said honestly. "But certainty is expensive tonight and we're short on budget." He made a sound that in a different situation might have been a laugh. They took the stairs. She kept her hand near the wall and her eyes on the landings above. The stairwell was concrete and echo-prone, the kind of space where footsteps from any direction were loud, which cut both ways. She could hear the city through the vent slats. She could not hear pursuit, which was either good or a much more sophisticated problem. "Third floor landing," she held up a hand. "Nothing." They moved. "You said past tense," Caruso said, and she could tell by his breathing that the stairs were working harder on him than he wanted to show. "The task force." "Yes, but you're still looking." "Yes. For what?" "The task force is gone. Whatever you built, whoever you were building it for." "There are other offices," Lee said. "Other jurisdictions. Federal work doesn't always happen through federal channels. Sometimes it happens through a U.S. attorney who has different motivations than the people who shut my funding down." She paused. "And sometimes it happens because someone who was at a dinner table on a Thursday night decides he's tired of the way his story ends." Caruso was quiet for several stares. "You're asking me to cooperate," he said. "I'm not asking you anything tonight. Tonight, I'm just trying to get us to the roof. And tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she said. I have a meeting with someone who has been very patiently waiting for me to get them something useful, and I'll need to decide whether what I've been building for 18 months is enough on its own, or whether it needs a witness. The roof door was unlocked. Of course it was. Caruso had said he owned the building, and Lee was beginning to understand that a man who owned the building was also a man who didn't like to be trapped by it. The roof was flat and vast, the mechanical equipment clustered to the east, the sky above them the particular orange-grey of a city night that never went fully dark. The wind-up here was different from the wind at street level. More honest, somehow, less mediated by all the things humans had built to interrupt it. She looked back at the rooftop access door, listened. Still nothing. Below and to the north, she could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles converging on Meridian. Someone had finally called. She watched the pattern of the lights and did a rough count. Fire, police, probably EMS, and understood that in approximately 10 minutes this roof and everything surrounding it was going to become a very structured environment that left very little room for improvisation. I've spent 30 years, Caruso said from behind her, making sure that no one in my position ever has to have this conversation. I know. The people I've worked with, the deals I've made, the things he stopped. There would be consequences, for me, obviously, but also for people who chose to be in business with me because I was the better alternative to what they were afraid of. I know that too. You've been studying me for 18 months. You know all of it, most of it, Lee said. There are gaps. There are always gaps. She turned to look at him. In the orange-grey light, he looked his age in a way he hadn't in the restaurant. Not diminished, but honest. Like a building at dusk that lets you see its real materials. That's why testimony matters. You can fill gaps that documentation can't. He was quiet. I should let you go, he said finally. I should make a call and have you quietly gone and this entire evening reclassified as a robbery. You could try, Lee said, without heat. I'm not going to. She waited. The man who sent Breck tonight, Caruso said. His name is Ellison Drago. He controls 3 members of the City Planning Commission and a federal appeals judge. He has been trying to take over my operations for 11 years, and I have been outmaneuvering him for 11 years, and tonight he decided to change the approach. He paused. He will try again. He has the resources to keep trying, and you'd rather not wait for the next attempt. I'm 71 years old, Caruso said. I am tired in ways I didn't expect to be tired. I have a daughter in Seattle who doesn't speak to me, which is correct of her, and a physician who has told me 3 times in the past year that my heart is conducting itself like a union organizer. Technically functional, loudly complaining, building toward a work stoppage. He was quiet for a moment. I have done a great deal of harm. Some of it I chose, some of it I inherited, most of it I rationalized. Lay said nothing. I am not going to tell you this is a conversion, he said. I'm not interested in performing remorse for people's benefit, but I will tell you that having a 26-year-old woman throw herself onto a man twice her size in order to stop him from doing something she didn't even have a stake in stopping. He stopped. It changes the texture of an evening. I had a stake, Lee said quietly. What stake? She took a breath. This was not something she had planned to say. It was not something that had any tactical value. It was simply the truth, and she had found in 18 months of careful performance that she was increasingly tired of things that weren't true. 6 months before I took this job, she said, my mother was diagnosed with a vascular condition. It's manageable, but the management is expensive, and my salary from the task force was barely covering it. When the task force was shut down, I lost that salary. She watched the emergency lights below. I took the job at Meridian because it paid, and because it gave me access to the documents I needed, and because I needed the case to go somewhere that would justify the past 18 months of my life. But also because I needed to keep paying for my mother's care. And if I had walked out the back exit tonight, I would have kept my cover for maybe another 2 weeks before whoever sent Breck found me anyway, and then I'd have nothing. No case, no salary. No leverage. Caruso was very still. So it wasn't purely altruistic, she said. I want to be clear about that. It never is. But the way he said it wasn't cynical. It was something quieter than cynicism. What's your mother's name? The question surprised her. She almost didn't answer. Cecilia, she said. He nodded. Once, slowly, the way people nod when a name lands and settles into them somewhere. All right, he said. All right, what? All right, Miss Navarro. He straightened his jacket, a slightly absurd gesture given the champagne soaking the front of it. I would like to speak with your U.S. attorney. Below them, the sirens were getting closer, the perimeter tightening. She could hear voices on a radio somewhere in the building beneath them. The team, or the police, or both, the legitimate and the illegitimate, arriving simultaneously at a place where they'd have to sort themselves out. There are going to be a lot of questions tonight, Lee said. There usually are, Caruso said. When someone throws a champagne bottle at a man my size, you weren't supposed to know about the bottle. I know everything that happens at table 12, he said. And there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before, not warmth, exactly, but the edge of it. Including the young woman who didn't run when she should have. She moved toward the rooftop access door, because the sirens were close now and staying was no longer an option she had. There's one more thing, Caruso said, behind her. She stopped. The case you built, he said, the 18 months. Whatever you have, I want you to know it's not going to be enough on its own, not for Drago. He's insulated himself from documentation. He's very good at making sure nothing points at him directly. I know, Lee said. She had known it for 11 months, actually. Had been turning the problem over every morning at 4 a.m. while the laminated doughs chilled and the city was still quiet enough that you could hear yourself think. That's why I need the witness. She pushed the door open. Stairwell air, concrete smell, the sound of people moving below. Mrs. Navarro, Caruso said. She looked back at him, this 71-year-old man in a champagne-ruined suit, standing on a rooftop with the city's emergency lights painting him in red and blue, looking not like a crime lord, and not like a victim, but like someone who had just arrived, slightly late, at a decision he should have made years ago. You never told me what you were doing in the dining room, he said. When you came out of the kitchen, what you were thinking. She considered it. I wasn't thinking, she said. She stopped. Started again. My mother used to say that the hardest thing about being the kind of person who helps people is that you don't get to choose when it happens. It just happens. And you can either be the person who steps forward or the person who remembers that they didn't. Caruso looked at her for a long moment. Live better, he said. He said it the way you repeat something you've just heard for the first time and aren't sure yet what to do with it. Or at least try not to make the same mistakes twice. Something like that, Lee said. She went through the door and down the stairs, and she didn't look back. 2 months later, in a federal building 3 blocks from the restaurant where she'd burned a tray of croissants and cried about it in the walk-in, Richard Caruso sat across from a U.S. attorney and spoke for 6 hours without stopping. He was specific. He was precise. He filled 11 months' worth of gaps in documentation with the kind of detail that only comes from someone who was present at the creation of the thing you're trying to dismantle. Lee was in the observation room, watching through glass. At one point, Caruso looked up from the table, toward the window, as though he knew she was there. His expression did not change, but he held the look for a moment before returning to the question he'd been asked. She thought about her mother's room on the 4th floor, the window facing the parking structure. She thought about the fact that she'd paid last month's bill and next month's. She thought about the specific smell of a restaurant kitchen at 4 a.m. Butter, clean steel, something always burning slightly somewhere, and how she had spent 18 months using it as cover and had accidentally, in the process, come to love it. Ellison Drago was indicted 4 months after that. 3 members of the City Planning Commission resigned in the same week. The federal appeals judge retired quietly, citing health concerns that nobody examined too carefully. Lee was not in the room when any of this happened. She was at a different stove, in a different city, in a different borrowed life, because that was the nature of the work, and she had known it going in. But sometimes, in the hour before the city woke up, when the doughs were chilling and the kitchen was still, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigeration units, keeping everything exactly as cold as it needed to be, she would think about a man on a rooftop repeating words back to himself like someone trying to learn a new language. And she would think that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth burning the croissants for.